The smell of unfamiliar sneak thieves finds us. The way is shut to you. Apologize.
Okay, so I did this with the Volume 5 review too, but let me be clear about one thing right off the bat. There are some people who really like this show and want people to give it a chance. There are some other people who hate it so much that even while running a completely unrelated podcast, they still can't get through a single episode without mentioning how much it sucks. Not gonna name any names. Just so that doesn't sound like an attack, I'll mention that I really like that podcast. I also really like RWBY, but I wouldn't consider myself a member of that first category. I do think the show's worth a watch, but if you think it's hot garbage, I can't really disagree with you. I just don't entirely agree, either. I criticize this show because I like it, and I want it to be better, not because I'm affronted by the mere idea that it has the audacity to continue being made. Are we clear on that? Okay, so, let's start with some of the good. Okay, this scene for one. For another, something that I absolutely loved about this volume, and that was severely lacking in the last three, was an interesting setting. As much care that was clearly afforded to making Mistral distinct from Vale, the small amount of world building it was given felt like little more than a backdrop. The city of Mistral being built into a mountain, and getting shadier and shadier the further down you go, is a neat idea, but it doesn't mean much if the only thing the team actually does there is sit in a room, and then go have a 6-hour fight in another bigger room. Here, in Atlas, the world building isn't just awesome, it also matters. The dichotomy between Mantle and Atlas, and the mistrust surrounding Atlas's government after the fall of Beacon. The drones flying around everywhere. The vigilante political group campaigning for office and rooting around for military secrets in the shadows. The SDC's monopoly on dust and greedy business practices. The need for a heating grid or a projected aura to even survive the biting cold. All of that sounds like it would make for an interesting setting for a D&D game, but it's also essential to the actual story being told. It isn't just background noise crammed in for world building's sake. Another thing that's really strong here, and something that I feel like people don't give RWBY enough credit for nailing, is romance. Romantic subplots are usually kind of crappy, because they've become so widespread and so expected that we've all gotten used to main guy kissing main girl at the end and then stop thinking of it as a subplot. But in RWBY, romance arcs are relationship arcs. They're driven by cause and effect. They have thematic significance. They're tied to the character's growth as people and interwoven with the rest of the narrative. You know, like an actual subplot. The way Blake and Yang's relationship was written this volume was seriously impressive, which I know is rich coming from me. That line from the Apathy video about how tragic it would be if Blake's romance with Sun was cut short has truly aged like a fine wine.
How are you today? I'm doing well. How about you?
Oh, they fucking look at them sparks.
They're just talking to each other.
I know there are plenty of people who think this subplot is forced, which is something I don't want to discredit immediately, but a lot of those people make their ulterior motives for disliking it pretty obvious. The reason is that they hate the gays. But the truth is, homophobic or not, the people calling it forced can eat my socks because I couldn't disagree more. It actually feels extremely natural, especially with how it builds off of Volume 6's ending. Admittedly, the progression doesn't have much conflict and doesn't really have much to do with anything, but that's why it's kept fairly minimal and they don't cram a kiss in there at the end where it doesn't belong, unlike some romance arcs. That will come, but hopefully not so soon. This relationship arc already has great chemistry, but it can go even deeper, be even more dramatic, and I'm eager for it. Plus, one of the few places where it actually does affect the rest of the narrative, with Renora, makes so much sense. Volume 4 ended on a very promising note for those two, and then their arc just kind of got put on pause for 2 volumes as they predictably stopped being important. So I totally buy that Nora would pick up on those two falling for each other and go, wait, now that you mention it, why the fuck aren't we dating yet? And like Bumblebee, perhaps to an even greater extent, it is grounded, so grounded in character. Ren is not a talker, he is a doer. This is something that has been shown to us from the very beginning of the series. In Volume 4, we saw how he can get caught up in the act of doing, failing to slow down and actually address his emotions. He probably would have died if not for Nora, and after she saves him, he seems grateful. But now, things are different. Exactly what it is they're fighting has become very clear to all of them. And as the finale spells out, Ren is scared. He's afraid that if he does not do as his father taught and take action, they won't be ready, and Beacon will repeat. In that regard, he's not unlike Ironwood, which is probably why he seems to look up to the guy. You should probably find a better role model, bro. But he's also afraid of being with Nora, because to him, engaging in a happy relationship feels a little too much like letting his guard down. So when the volume ends with him unable to take action and strike down his foe because of his feelings for Nora, he breaks. And it's so sad. Look at him. The calm, cool, collected guy is crying. The one place where I feel they fumble a bit with Renora is in episode 7, which sucks because episode 6 was phenomenal setup. They established Ren's weird and still mostly unexplained ability to sense stuff like a Jedi, which they also referenced in episode 1. And soon after, he and Nora are arguing about whether it's okay to be taking a night off and relaxing a bit while Salem is still out there. To emphasize this, Nora and Ruby don't even bring their weapons, whereas Ren is fully armed and ready. Well, actually, he's only ready until Nora grabs him and fulfills the ancient prophecy painted on the walls of Volume 1. His eyes roll back in his head, he sinks into it, and just lets it happen. For a second, you think, maybe she did it. Maybe she can get through to him. And immediately Tyrion shows up and ruins everything. Ren would have sensed him coming like he did last time, but he was a little distracted. He let his guard down for a millisecond and was instantly punished for it. Does that sound familiar? We'll get to you, Ironwood. But then, in episode 7, despite the fact that Nora just accidentally proved Ren's entire point, the only continuation of that conflict that we get is Ren being loyal to Ironwood, which is good and all, but that's it? What is going on between those two? Did they have a conversation? Are they not talking? Does Nora realize exactly why he's mad? Does she have any rebuttal to the idea that letting their guards down is the reason Tyrion pulled that off? You didn't establish anything. What's going on? Renora in episode 6 comes crashing down on the audience's heads, but there's barely any immediate acknowledgement of those consequences in episode 7. And from there, the subplot doesn't really go anywhere until the Neo fight, which is a long span of time for the show to give them little attention beyond, yes, there is Big Sad still happening. But even taking all that into account, I still loved what they did with Renora this volume, and I'm hoping that they dramatize the hell out of the recovery next volume, rather than just sending them straight upwards with no setbacks. Can't wait to find out. While we're still fishing around for good things to say about this volume, I'll mention that the plot structure felt more coherent than it's been in a long time. Hell, the last volume that felt this coherent in terms of pacing and structure was like Volume 2. Volume 3 was good, but it had that massive shift dead center, which I really love and which I think works for its own reasons, but isn't really a trick that works more than once. Volume 4 was alright, but there was only one arc that built to an actually satisfying climax, and even that arc felt somewhat scattered at times. Volume 5 tried to do that whole tonal shift thing, but held all of the remotely interesting stuff hostage at the end of the volume, where nothing had the space to really shine. Volume 6 started out really strong, and for a millisecond looked like it was returning to RWBY's more episodic roots, but if you do want to call it episodic, the last episode was way too long and didn't quite stick the landing. Volume 7, however, feels closer to a particularly long movie than a web series, which is probably why watching it week to week was so damn frustrating. Its structure is very singular and self-contained, with a clear ending in mind that it builds to without going on too many tangents. Whether or not it builds to it well is a matter we'll dissect in more detail by looking at characters later, but in terms of how the story moves, I only have one real complaint. That complaint is that episodes 4 and 5 start to drag a little. All of the setup going on here doesn't really flow together in a causal way and probably could have been condensed. Even though I love Neon teasing Nora about her relationship to add fuel to the Renora fire, Team Funky does not need to be here. And I still stand by the point I made in my exposition video that Robin could have been introduced earlier and better. Also, do we really need 41 seconds dedicated to Weiss and Winter walking down a hallway? But that relatively minor issue aside, I have to applaud the way this volume climbs to its finale. Even the inevitable slower moments where characters just kind of stand around talking have some interesting stuff going on, and the exciting moments are fucking exciting. Ace Operatives and A Night Off are both phenomenal episodes. However, I will say that there were 2 episodes that should have felt exciting, dramatic, and ripe with consequences that absolutely didn't, and those episodes were were 8 and 9, which I will be referring to as the Schnee family drama arc. This is the point in the show's run that I was most nervous for Volume 7. It looked like Team RWBY and friends were just dodging all of the consequences that the show had essentially promised, which turned out to be a misdirection grounded in Ironwood's character arc that I actually really liked. Those consequences came crashing down in episode 12, but at the moment I had no idea that they would, and seeing the way that Jacques, Whitley, and Willow Schnee were handled only disappointed me more. Whitley at least has potential for the future, but in this volume he's little more than an obstacle, which could have been fine if he was a dramatic obstacle that Weiss had to overcome by relying on her character growth, but in actuality he's an obstacle for Team Juniper to overcome in an incredibly tropey fashion with a slightly comical double subversion at the end. I hesitate to call this sequence not funny, because there's definitely something about how Jean is animated here that makes me giggle in retrospect, but when I first saw it, I was not laughing. It utterly baffles me that it's Team Juniper who helps Weiss get past Whitley and not Team RWBY, her found family that previously stood with her against her blood relative in an incredibly touching moment, especially considering that at this point in time, Ren and Nora are still in the middle of a fight that has yet to be truly addressed. Why are they working together with no issues all of a sudden? Wouldn't Blake jump at the chance to make fun of a rich SDC asshole? Wouldn't Yang jump at the chance to make her laugh? Don't Weiss and RWBY have an adorable friendship centered around RWBY being a goofball that we quite simply do not see enough of these days? Why is this something that Juniper does? That makes no story sense. Then there's Willow. So Crow's whole alcoholism thing was too subtle, apparently. As interesting as it is to actually meet her and to witness just how horribly trapped she is, I can't help but feel like the consequences for Weiss leaving that Willow alludes to right at the beginning of that scene don't actually stop her or even really slow her down. Her mother sees that she feels bad, and that's all it takes for her to pull out that footage. Turns out she's glad Weiss left and isn't coming back. All Weiss has to do is meet her, which isn't not hard for her, but it isn't all it could have been. This scene not really being a struggle for her would have been just fine if it wasn't for the fact that the next one isn't a struggle either. Weiss throws Jacques in prison without any real effort. It's Volume 4 all over again, building tension based around Weiss's inner struggles and her father being a manipulative, clip-on tie-wearing bastard, and then a climax that just kind of happens without much fanfare. I understand that Weiss has successfully rejected Jacques and escaped from underneath his thumb, but that doesn't mean she shouldn't have to struggle to beat him. She has more difficulty during their first meeting in episode 4 than she does in the arc where she sends him to prison. And as a result, that first meeting feels a lot more like a triumph, even if it was supposed to be set up for this arc. I guess my main criticism here is that calling it the Schnee family drama arc was a dumb idea, because there's barely any Schnee family drama. Weiss doesn't have to struggle against Whitley to get past him, she doesn't really have to struggle with her mixed feelings towards her mother to get that security footage, and she doesn't have to struggle with Jacques at all to put him in jail. If only this arc had been more of a series of trials for her in which she could showcase how much she's learned and grown since the beginning of Volume 4, and perhaps even go through a bit of growth in response to her mother right here and now to come out on top. Not only would these two episodes be a lot more tense and exciting, but the moment where Weiss traps Jacques with the symbol of her successful war of independence, steps forward with the Huntress license that he didn't approve of her trying to attain, and says, "Jacques Schnee, you are under arrest," would feel infinitely more earned. But maybe there wasn't any drama because Weiss already had her moment and this confrontation was more about Winter. Okay, that's certainly a point that could be made. I actually liked how Winter's little arc about emotions started out, thinking she'd gotten over her previous feelings and could keep her contempt for her father under control, only to have an embarrassing outburst that was immediately used against the person she was trying to help. And then having her talk to Penny, someone who is sweet and innocent but who struggles with emotions, was a smart choice. Or at least, it would be if Penny actually struggled with emotions. More on that later. In theory, centering Winter's arc around the whole personal feelings versus duty thing is a great idea, since we've already seen that Winter tries to be uptight, mechanically efficient, and ruthlessly loyal, but that she's also terrible at that and at handling very strong emotions, like wounded pride or hatred of a particular avian individual. Especially since her duty of claiming the power of the Winter Maiden was both really important and a little morally questionable in those final few episodes, it would have been really interesting to witness the struggle between her sense of loyalty and her own radiantly powerful emotions. And we do get some of that, But with that climax in mind, it's kind of odd that episode 5 had her handling her emotions towards her winter maiden duty in a highly mature, stable, and seemingly healthy manner. Kind of runs counter to what seems to be written as more of a blind faith in the wrong place sort of thing towards the end. Even as Winter claims that personal feelings need to be wrestled with to ensure that one is doing the right thing, she still follows the man who is very obviously in the wrong. My final criticism of Winter is that all of that talk of personal feelings felt like lip service in the end, at least in this volume, because it didn't really go anywhere. Sure, you could say it had an effect on Penny, which I will disprove later, but she also ends the volume choosing Ironwood over Weiss and not even considering otherwise. When Weiss shows up, her reaction isn't "what was Ironwood thinking," it's "what did you do?" This has the potential to change in the future, and it probably will. I imagine Weiss and Winter are going to have some kind of dramatic showdown at some point in Volume 8 or beyond. But after everything they did with her and that epic fight at the end, it feels kind of weird coming to the realization that she didn't really go anywhere. Speaking of not going anywhere, RWBY is still an uninteresting protagonist. I know this is a contentious issue that I haven't really come down on one side or the other of until now, but I don't want to get into a multi-paragraph debate about it in the middle of a video that is already way too long, so the short version is that she started off as this quirky, naive, reckless, lovable idiot who was, on the inside, unsure of herself and her place in the world. And from there, she just gradually became this paragon-type hero, where instead of grappling with all of the horrible darkness along with everyone else, she remains the best of them, no matter what remnant throws at her. There are a few moments in Volume 4 where she doubts herself, but that is it. Other than that, she never gives up. She's trustworthy, she holds on to hope in even her darkest hour. She's a beacon of support and inspiration for others. She's confident in the face of uncertainty. All admirable traits, and not something that would necessarily make for a bad character, but a person's good qualities are only half of what makes a character interesting. In fact, I'd argue that what's most interesting about a character is what is wrong with them, and how they deal with it. RWBY does have flaws, but those flaws never really get in her way. She never has to struggle to overcome them, even as she repeatedly takes the weight of the world on her shoulders. And even though I've seen some Paragon-type characters written well, in RWBY's case I feel like it's only made her less fun to watch. Not just due to the lack of dramatic stakes or internal conflict, but also because the stoic leader personality has squeezed a lot of that Volume 1 personality and charm right out of her, leading to a character that feels emotionally stunted. Nowhere is this more clear than in episode 1 of Volume 7. One of her best friends from a bright and idyllic time in her life that is very far away and bathed in the cold glow of melancholy is suddenly back in her life. This friend was supposed to be tragically dead, and now, out of nowhere, she's descending from the sky like an angel and tackling her with the force of a jet engine just like she used to. If I was in her shoes, I would be feeling some very complex emotions. I'd be elated, and also probably kind of confused and conflicted. After all, when you lose someone, you have to adapt to a life that doesn't have them anymore, trying to put the tragedy of it all behind you and keep moving. So what happens when that tragedy is undone before your very eyes, long after you've recovered and moved on? Well, nothing, apparently. RWBY is happy, but not happy enough to shed tears, just slightly happy, and a little confused until Pietro explains how he rebuilt her, and then she moves on with her day. To be fair, there is a lot of other stuff going on, but she doesn't even seem to dedicate much thought to it when things calm down. They hang out and stuff, but it's played like two gals catching up after they haven't seen each other in a while, and not like, hey, so I thought you were dead, and seeing you again is making me feel a lot of things, and not all of them are good things. But that's not the end of the story. RWBY actually has something else going on this volume, which is so important that it comes up exactly twice.
Hey mom, dead mom.
Summer Rose. RWBY is still wondering about her mother, and we find out from Crow that her death wasn't really a death. She just went MIA, and I'm left wondering why Crow didn't tell RWBY this sooner. You never asked. Then, later, when RWBY is being the incredibly determined, fearless leader that she is in the face of the world's greatest evil, Salem brings her to her knees by essentially telling her that she killed her mom. Sounds great, right? People have been guessing that RWBY would have an emotional breakdown for a while now, and it makes sense. Despite all of the crazy shit she's done and been through, she's been nothing but stoic, so the logical thing for the story to do would be to finally break her. Except it doesn't really. Salem makes her cry and makes her silver eyes malfunction, but she's only out of commission for like a few minutes at most. After that, she gets right back up and keeps being her good old self. She clings to her ideals against Ironwood just as fiercely, beats the shit out of the Aesops, doesn't have to grapple with her emotions, stays focused on the task at hand, and even inexplicably gets her silver eyes under control just in time for it to conveniently wrap up the climax. She doesn't really break, she just cries a little and then moves on with her day. Does that sound familiar? Because to me it sounds exactly like episode 1. Emotionally stunted, uninteresting. And while we're talking about episode 1, I guess it's finally time we get to that part of the video. Or at least it would be if I had any kind of work ethic. Unfortunately, though the quarantine helps, I do have other things to worry about right now, and this review script is very long, so rather than condensing it and not being as thorough as I'd like, I made the decision to chop it in half. But not to worry, Part 2 is currently in development and will contain such exciting topics as Ironwood, Oscar, the Aesops, Clover's death, dramatic consequences, and yes, the not dead girl of the hour. However, I have a long history of promising that videos are on the way, only to be immediately waylaid by something unexpected, usually technology trouble, so keep an eye on Twitter or YouTube community posts if you want to make sure that that hasn't happened. So yeah, stay tuned, there's more Volume 7 talk on the way.
I come to make an announcement. Shadow the Hedgehog's a bitch-ass motherfucker. He pissed on my fucking wife. That's right. He took his hedgehog fucking quilly dick out and he pissed on my fucking wife.